The miners heard it before they saw it, a vibration that moved through rock and hull plating and the soles of work boots before it became anything the ear could name, something between a sustained horn blast and the groan of a continent shifting on its deepest fault line. The workers on the surface of Aegis VII, in the seconds before the planet crack tore their world open, managed to angle a few cameras toward the crater where the ground had split apart. What the cameras captured before the signal cut out was not the footage anyone expected to bring back from a mining operation. The footage shows a shape emerging from below, massive appendages, each as wide as the colony's main corridor, pulling upward through rubble and debris. A head, if you can call it that, defined by 5 phosphorescent nodes arranged in a ring around a central aperture wide enough to swallow a shuttle whole. A body that descends back into the crater before the camera can reach the end of it. A creature whose full length cannot fit inside any reasonable frame because there is simply too much of it to see at once. Dr. Chalice Mercer watched that footage from the Ishimura above and felt something give way inside him, something that had been holding pressure for years. He studied the creature rising from the rock below, commanding the smaller converted forms around it, filling the space where everything human had been, and he saw in it the proof of everything the Church of Unitology had ever promised him, a divine being emerging to claim what was always its own. He gave it a name. He called it the Hive Mind. He called it God. Mercer was wrong about almost everything. The remarkable thing is that nearly every other person who ever encountered this creature made their own version of the same mistake. Mercer's was the most dramatic. The versions belonging to other characters in the story and to the players working through Dead Space's corridors in the dark were quieter, more understandable, and just as inaccurate. This is an original interpretive analysis of the Dead Space lore, examining the Hive Mind as a deliberate piece of thematic architecture rather than simply a monster mythology, tracing how the game uses this entity to explore what happens when intelligent beings encounter something so far outside their experience that comprehension fails and the mind fills the gap with meaning that was never there. Over the next several hours, we are going to trace the full history of the Hive Mind. From its creation during a military experiment on Aegis VII over 200 years before the events of Dead Space, through its long dormancy beneath a quarantined and forgotten planet, through its awakening and the catastrophe that followed, and all the way to what it actually represents within the much larger and far more terrifying structure that the series eventually reveals. By the end of this video, you will understand why this creature has been misread at every turn by every character who encountered it, and why that consistent pattern of misreading is itself the most important thing the game is asking you to notice. If you are enjoying this series of Dead Space videos, please let me know in the comments. Suggestions for future video topics covering Dead Space or any other games are always welcome too. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us start. Chapter 1. The Sleep Below. Before the USG Ishimura was a graveyard, before the colony on Aegis VII was a ruin, before Isaac Clarke's name was attached to a necromorph outbreak that should have been impossible, the planet sat quietly in a restricted system at the far edge of where legal shipping lanes ended. The quarantine markers around the Aegis system were old by the time anyone with resources took a serious interest in them. Military hardware broadcasting a prohibition whose stated reasons were classified even from most of the officers who encountered the warning. In the navigational databases of the era, the explanatory files sealed behind clearance levels that most personnel would never reach. What those files contained, what the quarantine had been placed there to protect, was knowledge of something that had happened 2 centuries earlier, something that began as a scientific experiment and ended with a creature the size of a small settlement buried in the planet's crust. A creature that was still alive when the first Ishimura survey teams crossed the quarantine boundary. The red marker designated Marker 2A was at the center of all of it. Red markers are human-made copies of a much older object. The original artifact, the one that came before all the copies, arrived on Earth embedded inside an asteroid impact approximately 65 million years before any human being existed to find it. When researchers finally uncovered it in the Chicxulub crater in the 23rd century, They called it the Black Marker, and immediately noticed that it appeared to be a source of enormous energy. The governments of that era were desperate for energy. They did what governments desperate for anything tend to do. They studied it. They copied it. They used the construction formulas the marker encoded into the minds of the people exposed to it long enough to become receptive, and they sent those copies to remote locations where testing could proceed without drawing attention to what was actually being researched. Aegis VII was chosen as one of those remote locations for Marker 3A. Picture the research outpost the way it looked before the outbreak. Standard colony architecture, pressure-sealed corridors, modular laboratory sections, a habitat ring for the scientists and military personnel who would spend months at a time studying the object below. The planet itself was otherwise unremarkable, cold, resource-rich in the geological sense, far enough from anything that mattered to make it a genuinely useful testing ground for something dangerous. The researchers who arrived did not fully understand what was dangerous about the marker they had come to study. That understanding would only arrive after it was too late to apply. The marker's signal does not announce itself. It does not begin with a visible effect that a trained observer could identify and quarantine. It operates below conscious awareness, embedding itself in the minds of those exposed to it as something that feels less like external influence and more like internal intuition. Researchers who had spent weeks near the object began to see things, to hear things, to draw symbols on the margins of their reports, on their walls, on whatever surface was available, symbols that appeared later on the marker's own surface in configurations the researchers had not consciously examined. The signal was communicating, but in a form that the receiving minds had no framework to recognize as communication. Their bodies began expressing something their conscious minds could not parse. People collapsed. People died. People died in the specific, accumulating way that provides raw material for the process the marker had actually been designed to initiate. Necromorphs are not supernatural. This matters to establish clearly, because the atmosphere of the Dead Space games does considerable work creating the impression that something transcendent is at play, and that impression is by design. What happens to a body exposed to the marker's signal is biological. The marker broadcasts an electromagnetic field that carries a genetic template, a set of instructions for restructuring dead tissue at the cellular level. Cells that would normally break down are reactivated and reorganized according to that template. The result is a creature built from biological material that has been repurposed to fulfill specific functions within the marker's system. The language of death and resurrection, which the Church of Unitology would later apply to this process, is emotionally resonant but mechanically wrong. Resurrection implies a return of the self. What the marker produces from a dead body has nothing of the original person in it. The original person's tissue is used the way a factory uses raw materials. What comes out the other end is a new product. The necromorph forms that emerged during the early stages of the first Aegis VII incident spread and multiplied according to the pattern the marker was designed to produce. Converted bodies created more necromorphs created more corpses provided more raw material for the marker to work with. The escalation moved along a curve that the survivors of the early outbreak stages described as feeling like an inevitability accelerating, as though the research colony had always been destined to end this way, and the experiment had simply made the timeline visible. What no one anticipated, what had no precedent in the research the military teams had access to, was what happened when the accumulated mass of converted tissue reached a sufficient scale. A hive mind does not form from a single conversion event. No dramatic emergence, no single spectacular moment where one creature transforms into another category of being. The process is one of accumulation and organization. Individual necromorphs are components. The hive mind is the assembled structure those components build toward when enough of them exist in sufficient proximity, drawn by the marker's signal into increasingly complex arrangements until the arrangement develops emergent properties no individual component possesses. Biology offers a useful reference point here. Certain organisms in nature operate not as collections of individuals, but as unified entities whose behavior and apparent intelligence emerge from the interaction of all their parts together. The cellular slime mold, a species found in forest floors across the world, spends most of its existence as separate individual cells, each technically autonomous, each capable of surviving independently. When food becomes scarce, these individual organisms do something remarkable. They merge, not metaphorically but physically, their bodies combining into a single coherent organism that can navigate toward food sources, flow around obstacles, and distribute resources through its structure with a consistency that suggests planning. Research with slime mold in maze environments has found that the organism reliably selects the shortest available path to a food source, often within a time frame that rules out random exploration. The slime mold has no brain, no central nerve cluster, no individual cell in charge of the others. The intelligence that produces these behaviors is not located anywhere inside the organism. It emerges from the pattern of interaction between all the parts simultaneously. The hive mind operates on a related principle, with a distinction that darkens the comparison considerably. Slime mold cells choose to merge when conditions favor it. The biological materials that compose the hive mind had no such choice. The people whose converted tissue makes up the creature's body did not participate in a process they understood or could consent to. They were absorbed. The marker's signal claimed their dead bodies and reorganized that material according to a template that left nothing of the original individuals inside the result. Every tentacle, every section of fleshy mass, every vital organ behind that rib cage at the creature's center represents biological material that was once a person going about their work on an outpost at the edge of explored space. Engineers, scientists, administrative staff, people who had lived for months in close quarters with one another, who had names and habits and private concerns. All of that dissolved into component material for something that had no awareness of what it had consumed. When the military researchers faced the assembled creature, they had no framework for what they were looking at. The entity was too large to destroy with anything they carried. Conventional containment approaches, the depressurization protocols, and seal sequences designed to handle necromorph outbreaks in corridor environments had no application to something this scale. Conventional weapons had no visible effect on its overall function. The researchers who remained could observe the creature commanding the smaller necromorphs around it with a coordination that suggested intelligence, but they had no way to reach or negotiate with whatever was producing that coordination. What they eventually discovered, through a process of desperate trial, in circumstances the records describe only in the most general terms, was that repositioning the marker itself within the crater altered the character of the signal the artifact was broadcasting. A specific pedestal within the excavation site held the marker in an alignment that shifted the signal's function. From this position, the marker appeared to suppress the hive mind rather than direct it. The creature's activity diminished. The smaller necromorphs lost their coordinated behavior. The suppression was not perfect, and it was not permanent, but it was enough. The surviving researchers evacuated. The planet was classified restricted. The files were sealed. 200 years of silence followed. 200 years is a span of time that institutional memory handles poorly. Governments reorganize. Personnel retire and die. Clearance systems evolve, and the databases they protect accumulate records that fewer and fewer active personnel ever access. The specific reasons for the Aegis quarantine, the precise nature of what had been found, and what was sleeping beneath the surface, existed in files that most of the officials who technically could request them had no idea existed. The Concordance Extraction Corporation that eventually sent the Ishimura to the Aegis system was not the same organization that placed the quarantine. The institutions that had understood the danger had been replaced by institutions that understood only that certain systems were restricted, and restrictions, to an organization looking at resource-rich planets, often look less like warnings and more like bureaucratic friction. The CEC's mining colony was illegal in the technical sense. The quarantine was on record. But record and knowledge are different things. and the gap between them is where the disaster was allowed to incubate for 2 centuries. While all of that happened above the surface, the hive mind waited below, not with awareness of the passage of time, not with patience in any sense the word implies intention. The marker's suppression field held the creature in a state of reduced activity, its biological systems maintaining minimum function, its vast network of converted tissue neither growing nor deteriorating. The creature persisted the way a machine persists when its power is reduced to maintenance level. Not off, not dead, simply not running. The marker that had created it was also the lock on its cage. That tension, the same artifact serving contradictory functions simultaneously, is one of the stranger facts embedded in the hive mind's history. It was not a tension anyone designed deliberately. The marker was not built with the hive mind's eventual suppression in mind. The suppressive function of the pedestal configuration was an accidental discovery by people who had no other options. The artifact's actual design served purposes that the people operating it could not fully see. When the planet crack began and the Ishimura's equipment tore open the crust of Aegis VII, the crater and the marker inside it were exposed to different conditions. The signal that had been maintaining dormancy in its pedestal-anchored configuration began to shift. The dormancy lifted. The hive mind's biological systems moved from maintenance level toward full function, and the necromorphs multiplying in the colony above felt the difference. What the cameras captured in those few seconds of footage was not a god ascending, not a divine intelligence claiming its throne, a biological system resuming normal operation after a long interruption. The footage was real. What the footage showed was real. But the framework that the man watching it from the Ishimura above brought to what he was seeing, the vocabulary he used to understand it, that came entirely from inside his own mind, and the framework he chose would drive him to do things the creature he worshipped would never have requested. Chapter 2. The Face We Need to See. Dr. Chalice Mercer had been aboard the USG Ishimura as the vessel's chief science officer, a devout unitologist in a crew where the Church of Unitology held significant influence over personnel selection. His faith had not been unusual in that environment. What made Mercer unusual was the velocity with which his belief responded to the outbreak, the speed at which a structured religious commitment became something far more volatile. When the infection spread from the colony to the ship, and the Ishimura became a different kind of place than it had been, Mercer did not react the way the remaining crew members reacted. He did not attempt to seal sections or reach emergency communication channels or find other survivors to form a defensive group. He watched. He studied the necromorphs with a clinical attention that the people who witnessed him doing it found more disturbing than the creatures themselves. He collected the footage of the creature in the crater below. He processed it. And then he began to act on what the footage had shown him. He named the creature the Hive Mind, a name that describes a function in deliberately organizational terms, a nexus controlling a hive, a commander of a distributed system of subordinates. The choice of this name tells you more about Mercer than it tells you about the creature. He saw structure in the creature's behavior and gave that structure a title. He saw coordination in how the smaller necromorphs moved, and he inferred a central intelligence directing them with purpose. He concluded that the thing in the crater possessed the qualities of mind that the name implies. From there, the extension into religious conviction followed the grooves that had been worn into his thinking over years of unitology practice. If the marker was divine, and if convergence was the promised fulfillment of the marker's purpose, and if the hive mind had emerged from the marker's work, then the creature was evidence that the promises had always been real. It was the thing at the center of the faith made physical. It had spoken to him, Mercer believed, given him understanding, shown him his role in what was unfolding. His room became a laboratory. His surviving colleagues and patients became subjects. The experiments he conducted were aimed at studying and ultimately transmitting the necromorph conversion process to living hosts, an attempt to understand and perhaps direct the transformation the marker was producing. The unitologist prayer language that covered his walls, the drawings of the marker's symbols, the messages about what it meant to join the transformation, all of it expressed the same conviction, that the hive mind was a divine being, and that what was happening on the Ishimura was not a disaster but a revelation. Mercer was wrong. The creature in the crater had no awareness of him. It had no capacity to deliver revelation or sanction action, or speak to chosen believers. The coordination he observed in the necromorphs below had nothing to do with communication with him specifically. Yet his interpretation was not arbitrary. It followed from the framework he was using to perceive, and understanding that framework reveals something worth sitting with for a moment. Human beings have a cognitive system that researchers studying perception and decision-making describe as agent detection. The mechanism itself is evolutionary in origin. The brain developed in an environment where failing to detect the presence of a predator or a hostile agent carried catastrophic consequences. A sound in the grass that might be a predator is far more expensive to ignore than it is to flee from incorrectly. So the brain evolved a bias toward detection, a tendency to find agents, intentions, and purposeful behavior in ambiguous situations even when none are present. Better to be wrong about the noise in the grass and run than to be right about the noise and stand still. This system operates well beyond immediate physical threat scenarios. Humans extend it to weather systems, to diseases, to organizational behavior, to historical forces, to anything that appears to have consistent patterns of effect. The tendency to perceive purposeful intention behind events that are actually mechanistic or random is documented across cultures and cognitive conditions. People find faces in geological formations. People hear words in white noise. People interpret the recurrence of a certain kind of day as evidence that something out there has an opinion about their circumstances. When the ambiguous situation in question is not a sound in the grass but a creature the scale of a small settlement, with 5 focal points arranged symmetrically around a central aperture, exhibiting coordinated behavior across a network of smaller organisms, the agent detection system does not simply log a threat assessment, it constructs a full model of the entity's interior life from the exterior evidence available. It asks what kind of mind would produce this behavior. It asks what intentions would generate this form. It asks what relationship this agent has to the humans observing it. Mercer's construction was shaped entirely by the material he had available to think with, a lifetime of unitology doctrine, the promise that the marker's purpose was the elevation of humanity through convergence, the belief that those who understood the marker's nature occupied a special position in relation to whatever was coming. When he applied that material to the creature in the footage, it fit. The creature became the divine being the doctrine had described. The conversion of the dead became the elevation the doctrine had promised. The massacre on the colony became the first stage of an event the doctrine had always said was coming. The framework performed its function perfectly. Mercer saw exactly what a person with his framework, looking at that footage, was almost certain to see. Now consider Dr. Terence Kyne, whose engagement with the hive mind was dramatically calmer and more scientifically framed than Mercer's. Kyne was the ship's chief science officer and had spent time studying the footage before showing it to Isaac Clarke. His conclusion was that the creature controlled the necromorphs telepathically, and that returning the marker to its pedestal would calm the hive mind, reducing the threat to anyone still alive on the ship. He framed his understanding in the language of scientific observation, rather than religious revelation. But Kyne was being manipulated by the marker at the same time, receiving instructions through visions of his deceased wife Amelia, guided into actions the marker needed him to take, rather than actions that reflected his own rational assessment. The specific understanding he landed on, that the marker could be used to calm the creature and that this was a viable survival strategy, served the marker's purposes rather than Kyne's. The marker was not interested in calming the hive mind as a favor to the survivors. It was interested in returning to a position where it could transmit its signal at full potency. Kyne's framework was scientific rather than religious, but the marker filled it with conclusions that his framework couldn't verify and couldn't challenge because the information was arriving through an emotional channel, visions of someone he loved and had lost, rather than through evidentiary channels his scientific training could scrutinize. Both men misread the hive mind. Both misreadings served the marker. Neither man understood that relationship. Research into what psychologists call the anthropocentric attribution bias reveals something relevant here. When humans observe complex systems producing consistent patterns of behavior, whether those systems are animals, machines, weather events, or social institutions, they apply mental models originally developed for understanding other humans. They attribute interior states, intentions, goals, long-term planning. The richer and more threatening the system appears, the more elaborately humans attribute interior life to it. Larger predators receive more anthropomorphic thinking than smaller ones. More powerful organizations are more often described as having unified malicious plans than weaker ones. Severe weather events are described in intentional language at higher rates than mild ones. The hive mind activates every condition for maximum anthropomorphic attribution. It is enormous. Its behavior is coordinated across a network of other organisms in a way that resembles purposeful command. The sounds it produces register as deliberate signals rather than incidental noise. Its form includes structures, the arrangement of focal points around a central aperture, that human visual processing reads as analogous to a face. Every one of these features activates the pattern recognition systems that prompt humans to assign the richest possible interior life to what they are observing. The interior life that every character in the story assigns to it is wrong, not because the hive mind plays no functional role in the necromorph system. It clearly does. But because the model of that role that every character constructs turns out to be inaccurate in a specific direction that leads each of them to misunderstand what they are dealing with in ways that have real consequences. Mercer believes the hive mind is divine and has chosen him as a recipient of its communication. His actions across the game follow from that belief, driving him to conduct experiments aimed at facilitating a process the creature has no awareness of endorsing. Kine believes the hive mind can be managed through the marker's positioning in a way that will preserve human survivors. The marker uses his belief to pursue its own agenda, which has nothing to do with human preservation. Isaac Clarke's entire understanding of what he is fighting in the game's final confrontation is built from instructions relayed through Kine and through the marker's own hallucinated manipulations. He defeats the creature believing he has ended the threat. He has not. And here is where the misunderstanding becomes most interesting. Because the player, following Isaac through 12 chapters of corridors and darkness and grinding mechanical horror, builds exactly the same model of the situation that the characters inside the story are building. The hive mind looks like the final boss. The scale of it, the dramatic staging of the confrontation, the relief of surviving it, all of these signal that the creature is the source, the center, the thing that had to be destroyed to end the threat. The game is designed to produce that understanding. And then it gives you just enough information in the right sequence to understand that the understanding was constructed for you. Something sits above the hive mind in the hierarchy, something the hive mind itself has no individual awareness of, that it responds to without understanding, that uses it the way the hive mind uses the necromorphs below it. Something enormous and patient and ancient, for which the hive mind's entire existence is a single step in a much longer process. Understanding that requires examining what the marker is actually doing when it both creates and suppresses the creature, because that relationship, the one between the hive mind and the artifact that assembled it, turns out to be nothing like what any character in the story believes it to be. The marker does not serve the hive mind. The marker does not fear the hive mind. The hive mind's existence is not a complication for the marker's purposes. The hive mind is a stage in the marker's process, and what lies at the end of that process is what will change the way you understand everything that happened on Aegis VII. Chapter 3: The Marker's Lie. The relationship between the marker and the hive mind is the piece of Dead Space lore that gets summarized incorrectly more often than any other. The common version goes roughly like this: the marker creates necromorphs, the hive mind controls necromorphs, and the marker can be used to suppress the hive mind when things escalate beyond control. Each individual piece of that summary is technically grounded. Together they produce a picture of the situation that is wrong in a way that gets everyone who believes it killed. The marker does not suppress the hive mind because that is its job. The suppression function is real. The researchers on Aegis VII discovered it and used it to survive. Kine used it to frame an entire survival strategy. Isaac Clarke used it as the goal of his movement through the ship for most of the game, but a mechanism having a discoverable function and that function being the mechanism's purpose are two different things entirely. Every character in the story mistakes one for the other. Walk through what the marker does in sequence because the sequence is where the meaning lives. First, the marker broadcasts a signal that drives living minds toward the edge of their functional capacity. The signal does not arrive as something foreign. Research into how exposure to sustained electromagnetic fields affects cognitive patterns has found that the brain has significant difficulty distinguishing between information generated internally and information arriving through channels it cannot consciously identify. The marker's signal exploits this gap. People exposed to it over time begin to feel convinced of things they cannot source to any external experience. They begin drawing symbols they believe they invented. They begin feeling certainty about conclusions their reasoning has not actually reached. The signal compels specific individuals, those whose cognitive architecture can receive and hold the blueprint encoded within it, to act in ways that serve the marker's function, to replicate the marker, to build more copies, to carry the pattern into new locations. Second, simultaneously and continuously, the dead are being converted. The marker's field reaches corpses and restructures their tissue according to a biological template the signal carries. Individual necromorph forms emerge and begin doing what they are built to do. They gather more biomass. They convert more bodies. They expand the pool of raw material that the marker is accumulating for a specific purpose. Third, when that pool of converted tissue reaches sufficient scale, a hive mind assembles. This is not an accident or an unintended complication. The hive mind is a stage in the marker's process, a coordination structure that organizes the necromorph horde for the next step, which is convergence. The full drawing together of every piece of accumulated biological material around the marker's base, launched into the stratosphere by the energy the marker releases, combined and organized there into something that requires a different scale of understanding to properly see. The hive mind coordinates the necromorphs toward that moment. It is a stage manager for a performance that the stage manager itself does not survive. Now place the suppression function inside that picture. When the marker is positioned on the specific pedestal the Aegis VII researchers found, it alters the character of the signal in a way that reduces the hive mind's activity. The creature becomes dormant. The necromorphs lose their coordination. The outbreak appears to stabilize. What this looks like is the marker restraining the monster it created. What it actually is, based on everything the established lore will support, is something more ambiguous and more troubling. The exact mechanism by which the pedestal configuration alters the signal is not explained within the canon. The game does not describe it in technical terms. What the lore does establish is that the suppression function was temporary, that the marker's broader process continued during the suppression period, and that the configuration served the marker's overall design in ways that the researchers who discovered it did not understand and could not have understood with the information available to them. There is an image worth reaching for. A flame turned low is not extinguished, it is still burning. The marker in its pedestal configuration was still broadcasting, still imprinting, still drawing people toward it and encoding the self-replicating blueprint into the minds of those who could receive it. The most significant thing it was doing during the years of quiet on Aegis VII was exactly what it was designed to do in preparation for the next phase. Isaac Clarke is the evidence of that. When Isaac arrived on the Ishimura as part of the engineering repair team, his concern was survival and finding Nicole. He did not arrive intending to interact with an ancient alien artifact. The marker found him anyway. It found him because certain individuals possessed the cognitive architecture capable of receiving and holding the blueprint the marker encodes. The visions he experienced throughout the game, the apparitions of Nicole guiding him toward specific actions and locations, were the marker using the most effective communication channel available to it. The content of those visions served the marker's needs, not Isaac's. Every action the visions guided him toward advanced the process the marker was designed to advance. Reach the pedestal. return the marker to its position, carry the imprinted blueprint out of the system when the immediate outbreak was contained, and used to seed the next stage of replication. Isaac's survival was instrumental to the marker, not because the marker had affection for him, or respect for him, or any awareness of him as an individual, because the process required someone to carry the blueprint forward, and Isaac was the person in the right place with the right cognitive architecture to serve that function. The visions through Nicole were not alliance, they were the most efficient recruitment mechanism available. Kyne experienced a parallel version of this through visions of his deceased wife Amelia. The marker located the grief in him and used it as the channel through which to deliver instruction. The conclusions those visions led him to, that the marker could suppress the hive mind, that returning it to the pedestal was the path to survival, that the creature in the crater could be managed, were conclusions that served the marker's needs. Kyne's scientific intelligence was not overridden by the marker's influence. It was directed. His reasoning capacity was given specific premises through an emotional channel that his analytical training had no framework to scrutinize, because the information was arriving as the voice and image of someone he had loved and lost, not as a hypothesis subject to testing. This is a dynamic worth understanding on its own terms, separate from the science fiction of the Dead Space universe. Research into decision-making and persuasion has found consistently that emotional framing of information significantly affects how intelligent people evaluate it. Information arriving through an emotionally resonant channel gets less critical scrutiny than the same information arriving through a neutral one. The intelligence is still present, the reasoning is still operating, but it is operating on premises it has been given a reason to trust, and the reason to trust them is not rational. Both Isaac and Kyne believed they understood the relationship between the marker and the hive mind. Both believed the creature could be managed. Both were operating on information the marker had provided to achieve outcomes the marker needed. Neither understood the marker. The marker used both of them effectively enough that neither could have detected the manipulation from inside the experience of it. The hive mind, meanwhile, had no role in any of this. The marker's management of living minds, its recruitment of Isaac, its direction of Kyne, its long-game imprinting of the blueprint across 200 million years of apparent suppression, none of that required the hive mind's participation or even its awareness. The hive mind's function in the system is to coordinate the necromorphs. The marker's function in the system is to drive both the necromorph outbreak and the recruitment of living architects. These functions operate in parallel. They are not in conflict, but they are also not in partnership. The hive mind does not instruct the marker. The marker does not serve the hive mind. Both are components in something much larger, executing their respective functions, and the relationship between them is the relationship between any two components in the same machine. They interact. Their interactions produce outcomes neither individual component was designed to produce alone, but neither one is in charge of the other. Neither one is even aware of what the other is. This is the marker's deepest lie. Though lie is the wrong word because a lie requires an entity capable of deliberate deception. The marker does not lie. It simply operates in a way that every intelligent creature that encounters it misreads as something purposeful and directed at them specifically. It produces the experience of being guided by something that understands you, of being in a relationship with something that values your role, of operating in a system where the thing that appears to be in charge of you is itself the top of the structure. The hive mind appears to be at the top of the necromorph structure. The marker appears to be in control of the hive mind. Both appearances are wrong in the same direction, a direction that points consistently upward toward something the game spent 3 entries slowly revealing. Something transmits the signal that the markers relay. Something sent the markers out into the universe in the first place. Something is operating this entire system, across a scale that makes a planet's worth of necromorphs look like a single data point in a spreadsheet too long for any individual to read. The hive mind has no place in the upper portion of that structure. Neither does the marker. They are the local machinery, the operational layer, the tools that the actual operators of the system deploy at scale, on world after world, for a duration that predates the rise of human intelligence on Earth. Understanding what those operators are, and what the system they run is actually designed to produce changes the meaning of every single event in the Dead Space universe, including the defeat of the Hive Mind in Aegis VII's crater, including what Isaac thought he had achieved by surviving. Chapter 4: The Hierarchy of Puppets. Dead Space takes 3 games to show you what it is actually about. The first game shows you the immediate horror, a ship full of converted dead, a colony already gone, a creature in the rock below that commands it all. The second game shows you the human cost, what it means to carry the marker's imprint forward, what it costs to be the person the system chose to use. The third game shows you the machine that produced all of it. The machine is not the hive mind. The signal that the markers broadcast can be traced, not by characters within the story, most of whom lack the perspective and the survival time to trace anything, but by the cumulative lore that the franchise assembles across 3 games. The picture it assembles is this: the necromorphs receive direction from the hive mind. The hive mind relays the directives of the marker. The marker, in turn, does not generate its signal independently. The marker is a relay station. The signal originates elsewhere. The sources are the Brethren moons. Stepping back from the scale of a single planet, a single ship, a single colony, to the scale of the universe the Dead Space lore describes, you find planet-sized organisms drifting between star systems, biological entities whose outer surfaces consist of rock and mineral matter that accumulated around their living cores over enormously long periods, in the way that a shell accumulates around the organism that generates it. They travel, they broadcast, they consume. Each one of these entities is the result of a convergence event that was allowed to complete, a necromorph outbreak that ran its full cycle without interruption, the biological material of an entire civilization combined and organized into something that operates at planetary scale. Every necromorph infection begins with a marker. Every marker broadcasts the signal that drives the living toward building more markers, while converting the dead into necromorphs. Every necromorph outbreak, allowed to progress far enough, produces a hive mind that coordinates the accumulated tissue toward the critical mass that convergence requires. When convergence occurs, the marker pulls all the accumulated biological material into the stratosphere, where it merges and organizes into the core of a new Brethren moon. The rocky fragments of the planet itself are incorporated into the outer shell. The resulting entity, once complete, joins a network of similar entities spanning the galaxy and begins broadcasting the marker signal outward toward the next set of worlds. The chain is this: Brethren moons broadcast the signal, markers relay it, markers drive necromorph outbreaks, hive minds organize those outbreaks toward convergence. Convergence produces new Brethren moons, new moons join the network and broadcast to new markers on new worlds. The hive mind sits near the bottom of that structure. It is a mid-level coordinator in a process that operates at galactic scale, and its existence serves that process the way a construction foreman serves a building project. The foreman is essential. The foreman commands the workers on site. The foreman has genuine authority within their specific domain. The foreman has no say whatsoever in who commissioned the building, what the building is ultimately for, or whether the project continues after this particular foreman's work is done. The hive mind on Aegis VII commanded its necromorphs. It directed their behavior toward the accumulation of biomass. It oriented the horde toward the conditions that convergence required. Doing all of that, it was executing a program it did not write toward a conclusion it would not survive, in service of entities it had no awareness of. Consider the weight of that structure. A creature so massive that its body disappears into the depth of a planet. A creature that defeated every conventional military response during the first Aegis VII outbreak. A creature that a trained scientist devoted his life to worshipping as divine. That creature was a middle-level functional unit in a process operated by things that regard entire planets as raw material and entire civilizations as production runs. The Brethren moons are not characters in the conventional sense. They are not monsters with personalities and grudges and specific intentions toward the humans who encounter them. The lore grants them the ability to communicate through the marker signal and through direct transmission to those within range of their broadcast, but their relationship to the events on individual planets is something like the relationship of a tide to a single grain of sand on a beach it crosses. The grain is real. Its position shifts because of the tide, but the tide does not have an opinion about the grain. The hive mind on Aegis VII mattered to the Brethren Moon Network as a local coordinator of a process the network was running on many worlds simultaneously. Its defeat in the crater, the moment Isaac's actions destroyed it, was from the network's perspective a failed convergence event. The raw material was not gathered. The moon was not born at this location. The process would resume elsewhere, through other markers, other outbreaks, other hive minds assembled from other dead. The evidence for this structure becomes clearest in the events of Dead Space 3 and what the game reveals about Tau Volantis. The planet and the moon orbiting it show what happens when the convergence process is arrested midway rather than completed or defeated. An alien civilization far older than humanity had been through the full marker sequence on their world. The signal had reached them. They had replicated the marker, studied it, built the outbreaks. Eventually they arrived at the moment of convergence itself, and the moon had begun to form in the orbit above their planet. Partially formed, alive but incomplete. The aliens had prepared for this moment. At some point before the outbreak reached its critical stage, they constructed a machine capable of arresting the convergence process. They activated it. The machine froze Tau Volantis and held the partially formed moon in a suspended state above a world they had turned into a frozen barrier. The moon was trapped between its birth and its completion, held in dormant orbit, conscious enough to broadcast but unable to act, and its signal reached through the markers it could still influence and transmitted something that translated, in human language, as a demand to finish what had been started, to turn off the machine, to let the convergence complete. The hive mind that Isaac and his companions encounter on Tau Volantis, the entity the third game calls the Nexus, was assembled from the bodies of the aliens who once lived on that planet. Not human bodies, a different species, with different biology, producing a different physical form, but the same function, the same role in the same hierarchy, a local coordinator, built from the dead of a civilization, directing necromorphs toward the conditions the Brethren Moon above needed in order to complete its formation. This fact reframes everything, because it demonstrates that the hive mind is a role the system creates, not a unique creature that exists independently of the system. When a necromorph outbreak reaches sufficient scale, the system produces a hive mind. The specific form that hive mind takes depends on the biological material available. Human bodies produce one form, alien bodies produce another. The shape differs, the material differs. The function within the hierarchy is the same in both cases. There is no singular hive mind. There is a function the system needs performed at a certain scale of outbreak, and the system produces an organism to perform that function from whatever dead bodies are available. The Aegis VII hive mind was built from the dead of the colony and the early researchers. The Tau Volantis Nexus was built from the dead of an alien civilization. Both were local coordinators for the same machine. Both were discarded when the local process was interrupted. Mercer called the creature divine. He was worshipping a component. The component had no awareness of being worshipped. It had no capacity to acknowledge his devotion, grant his requests, or sanction the things he was doing in its name. It was executing its function with the same relation to Mercer's prayers as a furnace has to the prayers of the person warming themselves beside it. Now hold that picture alongside the scale of what the Brethren Moons represent. Each one is the product of a convergence event. Each one is made from the biological material of an entire civilization, compressed and organized into a planetary scale organism that then travels between star systems and broadcasts the signal to the next set of targets. The lore establishes that the black marker found on Earth arrived in an asteroid impact approximately 65 million years ago, long before the first human being existed. The process was already running when the organisms that would eventually evolve into humanity were not yet distinguishable from the other small animals surviving the same impact. Research into deep time, the spans of geological and cosmological history that precede human existence, has found that human minds have a specific difficulty processing timescales beyond a few generations. The difficulty is not intellectual. People can state the numbers: 65 million years, 4 billion years, the age of the universe. The mind processes those figures as concepts and immediately loses the ability to feel what they mean. The cognitive machinery built for navigating a human life, with its decades and its generations and its historical memory reaching back a few thousand years at most, simply has no chamber large enough to hold 65 million years as a felt reality, rather than an abstract statement. The Brethren Moon Network has been running for at least that long. The process that produces hive minds, gathers biomass, triggers convergence events, and grows the network has been operating on a scale and over a duration that the human mind can state but cannot feel. The hive mind that Isaac Clarke fought in the crater of Aegis VII was one local step in a process that was running simultaneously across a galaxy, driven by entities that had been doing this since before the dinosaurs existed. Mercer, staring at the footage of that creature, feeling certainty rise in him about what he was seeing, was experiencing something genuinely human in the worst possible context. He was applying the cognitive tools available to him to a situation those tools were not built to process, and the tools told him what they tell every mind that encounters something this far outside its reference frame. They told him it must be in charge, it must have purpose, it must have chosen him. None of those things were true, but the alternative, that he was looking at a biological component in a machine too large and too old to see in full, that the machine had no awareness of him or his faith, that his entire life's conviction had been oriented toward something that was itself a kind of puppet, was not a conclusion any human cognitive system will arrive at easily when the evidence in front of it looks like that creature rising from the crater. The hive mind does not know it is misunderstood. It has no capacity to care that it was worshipped incorrectly, managed incorrectly, or defeated by a man who thought doing so had solved the problem. Whatever awareness the creature possessed in its coordinating function did not extend to an understanding of its own position in the structure it served. In that, it shares something with nearly every character in the franchise who ever tried to make sense of it. The next question is how the specific disaster of Aegis VII unfolded given all of this, and what it means that Isaac Clarke, who survived the hive mind, emerged from it carrying something the marker had put inside him that he would not fully reckon with until Dead Space 2 showed him what the marker had been doing to his mind all along. Chapter 5: 200 Years of Nothing. The quarantine on the Aegis system did not vanish. The automated hardware maintained it. Navigational databases kept the planet flagged as restricted, but a prohibition that survives only inside records, after the people who understood its purpose have retired or been reassigned or died, does a different kind of work than a prohibition that is actively known and actively explained. Over 200 years, the files attached to the Aegis restriction went through a process that research into organizational behavior has documented consistently. Important information, classified during moments of genuine urgency, tends to drift. The people who created the classification understood it clearly. The people they trained understood it partially. The people who inherited it from that second generation understood only the designation, restricted, access level high, reasons sealed. The specific knowledge that gave the classification its weight was no longer inside the organization in any living form. The record remained. The understanding the record was meant to carry had been diluted across too many transitions to survive. Research into large-scale industrial disasters has found this pattern so consistently that it has its own name in organizational literature: institutional forgetting. Organizations do not lose dangerous knowledge through carelessness alone. They lose it through the ordinary passage of time applied to any system run by people who change. Retirement, restructuring, reassignment, the accumulation of competing priorities that crowd out older knowledge until it is technically retrievable but practically dead. The file says keep out. The file no longer explains what is inside. By the time the Concordance Extraction Corporation identified Aegis VII as a viable extraction target, The restriction on that system was a bureaucratic status, with no active enforcer and no currently accessible explanation for why it existed. The people making the resource decisions were not choosing to ignore a clearly communicated danger. They were making an extraction calculation in an information environment that lacked the relevant warning in any usable form. From inside that environment, a restricted zone without a clear current authority behind it looked like friction. The kind of friction that organizations built around resource extraction learned to navigate as a matter of routine. The decision to build the mining colony was illegal in the strict sense. The quarantine was on record. The gap between that record and the working knowledge of the people who made the decision was wide enough to drive a planet cracker through. The miners who arrived on Aegis VII were doing standard work in what appeared to be a standard environment. Cold planet, promising mineral surveys. A system remote enough that claimed competition was not a concern. The restricted status of the system had not been communicated to them as a warning with specific content. It was a technical status, background information, the kind of detail that exists in files that workers in their position do not have reason to read. The lore does not specify the exact circumstances in which the miners found Marker 3A. What is established is that finding it triggered a new phase of the disaster that had been paused on Aegis VII for 2 centuries. The marker began its first phase work at the moment of discovery. The effect on the colonists' minds started the way it always starts, gradually, building in the way the first outbreak had built 200 years earlier, before anyone on the planet had the context to recognize what they were experiencing. The marker's first phase effect does not announce itself as external. This is the detail that makes it uniquely dangerous and uniquely difficult to respond to. A contaminant with a visible source can be identified and avoided. A pathogen that produces clear symptoms can be recognized and quarantined. What the marker does to living minds does not arrive as a foreign intrusion. It arrives as an intensification of what is already present, certainties that grow without clear reasoning behind them. The feeling of meaning pressing inward from the edges of perception. Compulsions that feel like internal convictions rather than external commands. The symbols appearing on the walls of the colony, drawn by hands whose owners could not explain why they were drawing them, were produced by minds that had no awareness of receiving anything from outside themselves. Research into how people process the boundary between internal and external information has found that the brain does not have a reliable mechanism for distinguishing between information it generates and information that arrives through channels it cannot consciously identify. The marker signal exploits that gap. The people affected by it are not, from their own perspective, being influenced. They are thinking, feeling, deciding. The influence is invisible to the one experiencing it, which means the response it generates feels chosen rather than compelled. The colony's records that Isaac Clarke would eventually encounter scattered through the game's environments show a settlement deteriorating from within. The logs do not identify a cause because the people writing them had no access to the cause. They were living inside an effect they could not source. Workers growing erratic, leadership becoming unstable, people making decisions that their colleagues found difficult to explain and that they themselves could not fully account for afterward. The social structures that keep an isolated colony functional were fraying in ways that looked, from inside, like the ordinary psychological pressure of remote work finally breaking people down. That appearance was the marker's first phase design operating correctly. A population that recognizes it as being affected by something external can organize a response. A population that experiences its deterioration as internal collapse organizes responses aimed at managing individuals rather than identifying a source. Counseling, rotation schedules, discipline for erratic behavior, all of it directed inward, at the people showing symptoms, while the thing producing the symptoms remained unexamined below the excavation site. The hive mind, deep in the rock beneath all of this, breathed at maintenance level throughout. The preparation happening above it served its eventual function, but required nothing from it. The creature was not directing the marker's first phase influence. Its role in the system had not yet begun. The marker was running the first phase without the hive mind's participation. because the marker's design did not require the hive mind's participation at this stage. The preparation of raw material and the coordination of raw material toward convergence are sequential functions, not simultaneous ones. There is something genuinely strange about the picture that produces. A creature the size of a settlement, sleeping below a colony that is falling apart around the thing that made it, 200 years of dormancy maintained by the same signal that was simultaneously preparing the next wave of material for it to command, and no party in the entire situation aware of how those processes connected. The marker was not coordinating its functions consciously. It had no consciousness to coordinate with. It was executing a design, and the design was complex enough to produce outcomes that appeared coordinated because they were built to work together. By the time the Ishimura arrived in orbit to begin the planet crack, the colony had been living under the marker's influence for long enough that the deterioration was visible in the records, in the audio logs, in the state of the facilities. The ship came to crack the planet for minerals. The planet had already been doing something to the people above the crack. The planet crack changed everything at once. The Ishimura's equipment opened the crust of Aegis VII, exposing the rock below to the surface. The alignment that had held the marker in its suppressive configuration was disrupted. The signal shifted. What the lore describes as the marker reaching its final potency is not a gradual escalation. It is a threshold being crossed. The dead on the colony's surface began to convert. The necromorphs that emerged moved with the coordinated purpose the smaller forms alone do not possess, because something below had resumed the function it had been designed to perform. The hive mind came back to operation the way a machine comes back to operation when power is restored, not through decision, not through anger or hunger or any state that maps onto felt experience. The conditions changed. The systems resumed. 200 years of silence ended without ceremony, without transition, without any moment that could be called an awakening in any sense that implied awareness of the interruption. Something you need to stay with, going into everything that happens next, is this. By the time the colony fell, by the time the footage was captured, by the time Mercer and Kine each looked at that creature and built the frameworks they would carry through the rest of their lives, the marker had already been doing something to Isaac Clarke that no one involved fully understood. Something that would matter far more than the defeat of the hive mind in that crater. Something that the game's ending, the survival, the escape, the apparent resolution, was never actually resolving. What Isaac carried out of Aegis VII was something the marker had put inside him deliberately, and what that imprint was designed to produce was not finished with him. The colony fell in hours, and what happened inside those hours is where the story of the hive mind, and the story of the entire disaster, comes into its sharpest focus. Chapter 6. The Colony Falls. The collapse of the Aegis VII colony happened faster than the records could keep up with. The few logs that survived the outbreak show a progression from deterioration to catastrophe over a span that the lore describes as hours. The mining operation, the human presence that had been slowly falling apart under the marker's first phase influence, was overrun once the hive mind resumed operation, and the necromorph conversion of the dead reached the scale needed to produce coordinated attack. Speed matters here in a way that goes beyond drama. The rapidity of the collapse speaks to something specific about how the system functions when all its phases are running simultaneously. The marker's first phase had already weakened the colony's social structures, reduced its capacity for organized response, created internal division and erratic behavior that made collective defense harder. The second phase, the conversion of the dead, arrived when the population's ability to respond was already compromised. The hive mind's coordination of the necromorphs gave direction to what would otherwise have been chaotic and slower. The phases were designed to compound each other. The first creates the conditions in which the second is most effective. The second creates the material for the third. The survivors who managed to capture footage of the hive mind in those hours were doing what humans do when they encounter something beyond their reference frame. They documented it. They recorded it. They pointed cameras at something their minds could not process and let the recording exist as a substitute for understanding. The footage itself, The blurry seconds of tentacles and scale represented the outermost boundary of what any of them could bring back from an experience that was already killing them. Dr. Terence Kyne obtained that footage. His response to it was organized around the scientific frameworks he had spent his career building. He saw a massive organism. He understood it as the coordinating intelligence for the necromorph system. He concluded that the marker's suppressive function, the pedestal configuration that the records described, offered a path to containing the creature and stabilizing the situation. His reasoning was not irrational. Within the information available to him, it was coherent. The marker had been used to suppress the hive mind before. Returning it to that position offered a mechanism. What Kyne could not see from inside his framework was that the marker was not a tool waiting for someone to wield it correctly. The marker was operating on him as it operated on everyone else in its range. The visions of his deceased wife, Amelia, which the lore establishes as the form Kyne's marker-influenced experiences took, were arriving through the channel of his deepest grief and directing him toward actions the marker needed him to perform. The conclusion he reached through his reasoning, that returning the marker to the pedestal was the viable survival path, was a conclusion the marker needed him to reach. Whether Kyne arrived at it through his own analysis or was guided there through his hallucinations is a question the lore leaves deliberately unresolved. The destination was the same regardless of how he reached it. Dr. Chalice Mercer watched the same footage and landed in a completely different place. His framework, built from years of unitology conviction, gave him a different vocabulary for what he was seeing. His response to the outbreak, the experiments he conducted in the medical section, the subjects he used, the ideology he built around what he observed, all of that followed from the framework he applied to the footage of the creature in the crater. He saw divinity. He organized his remaining actions around that interpretation. What the lore establishes clearly is that the hive mind had no awareness of Mercer's interpretation of it. The creature was not communicating with him in the way he believed. It was not sanctioning his actions or confirming his faith. The coordination the creature exercised extended to the necromorphs it commanded. It did not extend to the living humans aboard the ship above, at least not through any mechanism of the kind Mercer believed in. The marker was influencing living minds. The hive mind's function was the coordination of converted dead. Mercer's conviction that the creature had spoken to him and chosen him was a product of marker influence and unitology framework, not of any actual communication from the creature. Both men misread what they were looking at in ways that led them to actions serving the system's design rather than their own survival. Kyne worked to return the marker to the pedestal, which was what the marker needed. Mercer worked to facilitate the conversion process, which was also what the marker needed. Both used their genuine intelligence and their genuine expertise in pursuit of conclusions the marker's influence had pointed them toward. Neither had any way to identify the manipulation from inside the experience of it. Isaac Clarke's arrival in this situation added a dimension that neither Kyne nor Mercer was positioned to understand. The Kellion had been sent to the Ishimura in response to a distress signal. Isaac's reason for being there was personal as much as professional. Nicole Brennan was aboard the Ishimura. He needed to find her. That emotional investment, that specific kind of urgent personal need, combined with the disorientation of the environment he arrived in, made him exactly the kind of receptive mind the marker was built to work with. The visions of Nicole that guided Isaac through the Ishimura were the marker using the most effective available channel. Isaac's attachment to Nicole was real. His grief and hope about her were real. The experience of receiving direction through her image felt authentic because it was built from something authentic. The content of the direction, the specific actions it led him toward, served the marker's needs rather than his. Each stage of the journey through the ship moved him closer to the position the marker needed him to occupy. Kendra Daniels, who traveled to the Ishimura alongside Isaac as part of the Kellion crew, revealed her actual mission at the point in the story where that revelation served the larger conflict. She was an EarthGov agent. Her assignment was to secure the marker and return it to government custody, a mission that placed her interests and Isaac's on a collision course at precisely the moment when both of them had navigated most of the ship's horror to reach the position where the marker's fate would be decided. Her killing of Kyne removed one of the parties who might have complicated the recovery operation. Her attempt to flee with the marker was overridden by the marker's influence on Isaac, which drove him to act in ways that returned the situation to the trajectory the marker needed. What the marker needed, as the established lore makes clear, was for its self-replicating blueprint to be carried forward by someone capable of holding and eventually transmitting it. Isaac was that person. The imprinting of the blueprint into his mind during his time on the Ishimura and at the Aegis VII colony was the marker's primary operational success in the events of the first game. The blueprint would become the basis for the Site-12 marker constructed on Titan Station in Dead Space 2. The marker's ability to replicate itself through the minds of capable individuals was the function that mattered most, above any specific outcome of the immediate outbreak. The Hive Mind, waiting in the crater with its coordination function resumed and its necromorphs deployed across the colony, played no role in this imprinting. The marker's recruitment of Isaac was entirely separate from the Hive Mind's operations. They were running in parallel, serving the same larger process, with no direct coordination between them. When the marker was removed from the Ishimura and taken toward Aegis VII's surface, the coordination between the marker and the Hive Mind, the connection the lore describes as necessary for the two to function together properly, was disrupted. The Hive Mind's behavior became more aggressive and less specifically directed. The creature that had been below the surface, commanding its necromorphs from its crater, oriented itself toward anyone attempting to reach or leave the colony's landing areas. The confrontation between Isaac Clarke and the Hive Mind took place in the colony's shuttle bay area, with the marker returned to the planet's surface. The creature emerged from its crater and engaged directly, attacking with the tentacles and acidic projectiles the lore establishes as its physical offensive capabilities. What the lore does not establish is whether the Hive Mind had any awareness of Isaac specifically, or any intention toward him as an individual, as opposed to simply responding to the presence of living organisms in proximity to its territory. Isaac destroyed the vital organs of the creature. The Hive Mind, based on what followed in the game's ending, was defeated in that confrontation. The chunk of planetary material that the planet Crack had separated from Aegis VII was pulled back toward the colony afterward, and what remained of the Hive Mind went down with everything else. The necromorphs that survived the confrontation did not simply stop. The lore addresses this only partially, and the mechanism by which the Hive Mind's defeat affected the smaller necromorphs is not fully explained in the established canon. What is clear is that the infection itself, the marker's biological conversion of dead tissue, was not ended by the creature's defeat. The marker's influence, the blueprint in Isaac's mind, the broader network the marker was connected to, none of those ended with the creature in the crater. Isaac escaped on a shuttle. He believed he had ended the threat. The game's final moments, the vision that arrives as the shuttle moves away from the destroyed colony, tell a different story. The imprint the marker had placed inside him was not finished with him. What the game presented as a survival ending was, in the marker's terms, a successful delivery. The engineer who could carry the blueprint forward was clear of the immediate disaster and moving toward the next location where the process would continue. The Hive Mind's defeat accomplished nothing the Brethren Moon Network would classify as a setback. A local coordinator had been removed. The outbreak at this location had been interrupted before convergence could complete. The raw material was lost, but the blueprint was in Isaac's mind, moving through space toward populations the marker had not yet reached. From the network's perspective, the disaster at Aegis VII was a partial failure in the local process and a complete success in the replication process. The Hive Mind had served its function as far as it was able given the interruptions. It had coordinated the outbreak, it had directed the necromorphs, it had done the work of the stage it occupied in the larger system. Its defeat removed a component that the system would simply produce again in another location from another supply of dead once the next outbreak reached the necessary scale. The question that Dead Space 2 begins with, the question that Isaac's experience in the Ishimura had already answered without anyone around him being able to read the answer, was what happens to a person who carries the marker's blueprint forward without knowing they are carrying it, without understanding what the blueprint is designed to produce. without any framework for identifying the thing that has been working on them since they first boarded a dead ship looking for someone they loved. The answer is Titan Station. The answer is the Site-12 marker assembled in perfect alignment with everything that Isaac had been carrying inside him since Aegis VII. The answer is that the system the Brethren Moons built was not finished with one engineer in one shuttle moving away from one failed convergence event. The hive mind was gone. The machine it served was not. And Isaac Clarke, sleeping in a shuttle headed toward a station he did not choose, was the proof of that. Chapter 7: The Wrong Victory. The final minutes of the Aegis VII colony did not belong to Isaac Clarke. They belonged to the machine. Kendra Daniels had spent the events of Dead Space maintaining a facade of being what the mission needed her to be, a member of the repair team, a colleague working toward the same survival as everyone else. Her actual assignment was to secure the marker for EarthGov, to contain the artifact and return it to government custody in a way that served EarthGov's research agenda rather than any unitologist or independent interest. She had reached that objective. She had the marker. She had a working escape vehicle. She ran for it. The marker had other plans. The established lore describes Kendra being killed by the hive mind after she secured the marker and attempted to escape, reaching her before she could reach any position of safety. She crashed on the surface. She ran from the crash site toward the marker itself, the artifact sitting on the colony ground, and the hive mind's tentacles reached her before she could reach any position of safety. She was killed. What the lore does not establish is whether the hive mind specifically targeted Kendra as a threat to the marker, whether the creature was acting on direction from the marker signal, or whether her proximity to the creature's territory simply made her the nearest available target. The behavior pattern the hive mind demonstrated throughout the outbreak was consistent aggression toward living humans in proximity to its operational area. Whether Kendra's death was purposeful within the system's logic, or simply the creature doing what it was built to do in the presence of a living person, is not clearly explained in the canon. Isaac's confrontation with the hive mind, once Kendra was gone and he was alone on the surface with the creature, took place in 3 stages according to the game's structure. The creature attacked with tentacles. Isaac destroyed the 5 vital organs arranged around the head. The creature drew him closer to the second set of organs inside the cavity. He destroyed those as well. The hive mind fell back into the crater, or away from the colony's edge. What happened to the physical body of the creature after that is unclear. The established lore suggests it was either killed by the damage Isaac inflicted, or buried when the large chunk of planetary material separated during the planet crack fell back onto the colony. Whether the creature was definitively dead or simply incapacitated and buried is something the canon leaves without a clean answer. What is established is that the immediate threat to Isaac in that location ended. He reached a shuttle, he left Aegis VII, he believed he had finished what needed finishing. Research into how people process the resolution of immediate threats has found a consistent pattern that psychologists sometimes call premature closure. The human mind, when it survives something extreme, has a strong drive to classify the experience as complete, finished, behind rather than ahead. This drive serves a psychological function. Continuing to treat a survived threat as ongoing is exhausting and destabilizing in ways that make returning to functional living difficult. Closing the experience, marking it as a chapter that has ended, is adaptive in most circumstances. The specific failure of premature closure in Isaac's situation was that the threat he was classifying as finished was the visible physical component of a system that had already extended beyond him in a form he could not see or feel or categorize as a threat. The marker had imprinted a self-replicating blueprint into Isaac's mind during his time on the Ishimura and at the Aegis VII colony. This is established clearly in the lore of Dead Space 2. The blueprint in Isaac's neural tissue was used to create the Site-12 marker at Titan Station, built while Isaac was in a medical facility, rebuilt from patterns in his mind that he was not consciously accessing and could not voluntarily surrender or destroy. The process happened through his presence and his neural architecture, not through any deliberate contribution on his part. The marker needed a carrier. It needed someone whose mind could hold the blueprint, and who would survive the immediate disaster, travel to a populated location, and be available for the next stage of the process. Isaac Clarke was that person. The visions of Nicole that had guided him through the Ishimura had served the purpose of keeping him functional and directionally oriented toward the actions the marker needed, and when that guidance had produced the outcome the marker needed, the guidance stopped and Isaac was clear to leave. From the marker's operational perspective, the defeat of the hive mind was a secondary matter. The local convergence event had already failed when the outbreak was disrupted too early to gather sufficient biomass. Whether the hive mind survived or not was irrelevant to the marker's primary success at Aegis VII, which was the imprinting of a carrier with the replication blueprint. That carrier was now moving through space in a working shuttle, carrying the system's most important output from this location, heading toward a populated station where the next stage of the process could eventually begin. Isaac thought he had won. The system had gotten what it came for. That is not the reading most people come away with from the ending of Dead Space, and it is not the reading most analyses of the hive mind focus on when they account for what the creature's defeat accomplished or failed to accomplish. The hive mind is large, aggressive, and the source of the game's final confrontation, so its defeat registers as the climax in the way that narrative shape trains audiences to expect. The monster is gone. The threat is behind you. The survivor is in a shuttle. But there is something about the hive mind that almost no discussion of the Dead Space universe spends serious time with, something that the creature's physical existence raises and the game deliberately refuses to resolve, something that reframes what the horror of Dead Space actually is. If you look at the creature not as the final obstacle in Isaac's path, but as the thing it actually is. Every piece of it was a person once. That fact sits at the center of what comes next. Chapter 8. The Weight of the Dead. Look at the creature again without the framework of the fight. The hive mind's full size was never established with precision in the lore, because a significant portion of the creature remained inside the crater throughout the confrontation. What was visible above the crater's edge was already too large to resolve completely in any camera angle the game provides. The head region, defined by 5 glowing nodular structures arranged in a ring around the central aperture, rises above ground level. The thorax section features a protective ribcage structure sheltering a cavity that holds additional vital organs. The surface of the lower thorax has a texture the lore describes as resembling compressed human tissue with muscle covering certain areas. The tentacles grow from well below the thorax and are long enough and strong enough to reach operational structures at the colony's scale. The creature's sounds are present in more places in the established lore than a single playthrough of the first game reveals. The hive mind's wails appear in the audio environment of Dead Space 2 during the confrontation with the Site-12 marker, in the moments when the marker's hallucination of Nicole speaks to Isaac. The connection between those sounds and the creature from Aegis VII is established in the lore. What that connection means, whether it represents some form of continuity between the biological hive mind and the marker's signal, or whether the marker simply incorporated frequencies associated with the hive mind's coordination function into its own output, is not clearly explained. The physical details available from the lore describe an organism with visible biological organization, not a random mass of converted tissue. A structured organism with differentiated regions, protective structures, and what appear to be localized vital functions housed in specific areas. The 5 outer organs around the head and the 5 inner organs behind the rib cage represent concentrations of biological function rather than uniform distribution of material throughout the creature's body. Dead Space 3 provides a brief internal view of the Tau Volantis Nexus, the equivalent organism assembled from the alien population of that planet. Inside, the lore identifies what it describes as nerve clusters, structures that serve as relay points for the marker signal passing through the creature to the necromorphs it coordinates. This detail is significant because it positions the hive mind's coordinating function as a specific biological mechanism rather than an undefined phenomenon. The signal originates with the Brethren moons. The markers relay it. The hive mind passes it through dedicated nerve clusters to the necromorphs below. Each stage is a relay point in a chain, not a source of independent intelligence. The Tau Volantis nexus also establishes that the hive mind is a functional role the system produces, rather than a unique creature with fixed biology. The alien organisms that once lived on Tau Volantis were converted and assembled into a hive mind equivalent that shares core functional characteristics with the Aegis VII creature but differs significantly in external form. Both have 5 vital weak points on the head region. Both have the capacity to draw targets toward a central aperture. Both serve the same function in the necromorph hierarchy. The difference in appearance reflects the difference in the biological material available for assembly. Same role, different bodies. The role is what the system produces. The bodies are what happen to be available. Now stand with that picture and face the question the game will not answer for you. The people whose tissue composes the hive mind on Aegis VII were alive before the marker's first outbreak 2 centuries earlier. The research colony personnel, the scientists, the military staff, the support workers. At some point during the escalation of the first outbreak, each of them died, and the marker's template reached their dead tissue and began the conversion process. Over the period of the outbreak's accumulation, the converted material organized and merged into the creature that eventually settled into the crater and entered dormancy under the marker's suppression field. The lore does not tell us whether anything of those individuals persisted inside the organism that assembled from their remains. It does not confirm that the individual consciousnesses composing the hive mind were entirely erased by the conversion process. It also does not confirm that any trace of them survived. The canon sits in the gap between those 2 answers and does not fill it. This is a carefully constructed silence. The game did not leave the question unanswered because the answer was unimportant. It left the question unanswered because an unanswered question does a specific kind of work that no answer can replicate. Both possible answers that the people inside the hive mind are entirely gone, and that some trace of them persists in a state they could not have consented to and cannot escape, are deeply disturbing. The gap between them is where the creature's specific horror lives. Research into what generates lasting unease in horror contexts has found that ambiguity about the status of human consciousness produces more sustained discomfort than definitive answers in either direction. Confirmation of death closes the question. Confirmation of survival, even terrible survival, provides a defined category to hold the situation in. The space between those confirmed states activates a kind of cognitive discomfort that persists because it cannot be resolved. The mind keeps returning to the unanswered question because unanswered questions create a pull that answered ones do not. The hive mind's composition is designed, whether deliberately by the game's creators or as an emergent property of the lore's development, to produce exactly that kind of persistent unease. You fight it, you destroy its vital organs, you watch it fall, and somewhere in the space between those actions and the relief of surviving them, if you let the question in, you find yourself uncertain about what you just destroyed. Mercer's answer to that question was that the people inside the hive mind had been elevated. Their biological material had been recruited into something greater than individual existence. The Church of Unitology's concept of convergence was built on the promise that unity in death was not an ending but a transformation into a higher state. Mercer extended that framework to cover what he saw in the footage and in the creature below, because his framework required an answer and the question was too present to leave unanswered. If the people inside the hive mind were elevated rather than obliterated, then facilitating more conversions was an act of mercy rather than an act of harm. The framework resolved the discomfort of the question in a direction that made his actions feel justified. The framework was not supported by anything the lore establishes about how the marker's conversion process actually works. The biological mechanism the marker uses to restructure dead tissue does not preserve the information patterns that constitute individual consciousness in any form the lore describes as surviving conversion. But Mercer did not have access to a clear account of the mechanism. He had footage of a creature, a set of religious convictions, and the marker's active influence on his cognitive processes, working to push him toward conclusions that served the system's design. The second answer, that the people inside the hive mind are entirely gone and what remains is purely the system's construct, is cleaner, and in some ways less disturbing than the alternative. Dead is understandable. Dead has a boundary, but that answer also strips the hive mind of the specific quality that makes it more than just a very large necromorph. If the people composing it are entirely erased, the creature is simply biological machinery at scale, dangerous, horrifying in its size and its function, but not a monument. The unanswered version makes it a monument, a structure assembled from people who were taken from their lives without warning, converted without consent, and organized into something that would function in their absence as though they had never existed as individuals. Whether the experience of being inside that structure involves anything like awareness or suffering, or the faintest continuity of individual identity, is the question the game puts in front of you at the moment of the final confrontation, and then declines to resolve. You stand in front of the largest thing the game has shown you. You have been through 12 chapters of its corridors. You understand the scope of what happened, and the game asks you to destroy something that might still hold, in some form that neither the science nor the philosophy of the Dead Space universe can currently account for, the last traces of the people it was built from. Most players shoot the yellow sacks and feel relief. That relief is the correct survival response. It is also, if you hold the question open, slightly complicated. The system that assembled the hive mind does not care about the question. The brethren moons that transmit the signal do not care about the question. The marker that built the creature and then suppressed it and then woke it again when conditions changed had no capacity to care about the question. The question exists only for the observers who stand outside the system and look at what the system produces and try to understand what they are looking at. The hive mind has always presented observers with a version of that question. Every character who looked at it generated an answer, because the human mind does not sit comfortably in the unanswered gap. Mercer generated his answer from unitology. Kine generated his from scientific crisis management. Isaac generated his from the immediate calculus of survival. The players generate theirs from the conventions of survival horror and the narrative signals that tell them when a threat is meant to be defeated. All of those answers are frameworks applied from outside the creature to make it manageable. None of them address what the creature actually is. What the creature actually is, a biological relay station assembled from converted human dead, coordinating a local necromorph outbreak in service of a signal it receives from entities it has no awareness of, toward an outcome it has no capacity to conceptualize, holding inside it an unanswered question about what became of the people it was built from. That is what the lore supports. Everything else is what the observers brought to it. The final part of this story is about what happens when you take all of those misreadings together. Mercer's worship, Kine's management, Isaac's survival calculus, the player's encounter with a designed final boss, and look at what they have in common. Because the pattern of misreading is not random, it follows a shape, and that shape tells you something about what Dead Space is actually built to produce in the person experiencing it. That is what the last section of this analysis is for. Chapter 9. Every Wrong Answer. 3 people looked at the hive mind and arrived at 3 completely different conclusions. A zealot, a scientist, an engineer, each of them intelligent, each of them operating from genuine belief in what they saw, each of them catastrophically wrong in a way that had real consequences for everyone around them. Laying those 3 readings side by side, instead of examining them one at a time, reveals something that none of the individual readings makes visible on its own. The misreadings share a structure. They are different answers to the same question, built using different materials, arriving at different conclusions, but organized around the same underlying move. The move is this: all 3 of them looked at the hive mind and asked what kind of purpose it represented. Mercer asked what divine purpose the creature served. His answer was that it was the fulfillment of unitology's promises, the physical embodiment of convergence as salvation rather than extinction. His actions followed from that answer. He worked to accelerate the process he believed the creature was directing, sacrificing people to understand the mechanism of transformation, treating the outbreak as a revelation event rather than a disaster. Kine asked what functional purpose the creature served in the outbreak's structure and whether that function could be disrupted or redirected. His answer was that the hive mind was a coordinator that the marker could suppress, and that suppression offered a path through the crisis. His actions followed from that answer. He worked to return the marker to its pedestal, believing the move would stabilize the situation enough for survival. Isaac did not ask the question consciously. His engagement with the hive mind was built from what Kine told him and from what the marker's influence on him was driving him toward. He arrived at the final confrontation not with a theory about the creature, but with a goal that the situation had defined for him. Survive, defeat the immediate threat, get out. His actions followed from that goal in the way survival logic operates, directly and without the space for broader analysis. All three answers assigned the creature meaningful agency within a framework that made sense to the person applying it. Mercer's framework was theological. Kine's was scientific. Isaac's was survival-based. But all three assumed that the creature at the center of the disaster was the thing that mattered most within the disaster. That understanding it, managing it, or defeating it was the central task. None of them were asking the right question. The right question was what purpose the hive mind served within the system that produced it, not what the creature was doing in the outbreak, but what function it occupied in the design that made the outbreak possible. That question does not have an answer available to any character in the first game, because the design does not reveal itself until later in the franchise. But the question's absence from every character's reasoning is itself significant. Humans are extremely good at building models of immediate systems, and extremely limited in their capacity to build models of systems that are too large or too old to be directly observed. Research into how people assess risk and agency has found that threats which are visible, local, and physically dramatic receive the highest concentration of attention and interpretive effort, while threats that are diffuse, systemic, and operating at scales beyond direct observation are routinely underestimated or missed entirely. The predator in front of you commands all available cognitive resources. The environmental condition that made the predator possible commands almost none. The hive mind was the predator in front of every character in the story. The Brethren Moon Network was the environmental condition that made the hive mind possible. Every character focused on the predator. The condition went unexamined. This is not a failure of intelligence. Kine was a trained scientist with deep expertise in relevant areas. Mercer was educated, observant, and intellectually engaged with questions about the marker's nature even before the outbreak. Isaac Clarke, who is often read as a passive figure being moved through events, demonstrates consistent practical intelligence throughout the game in the decisions his survival requires. None of them were incapable of larger systems thinking. They were caught in a situation where the immediate threat consumed the entire available attention, which is exactly the condition under which systemic thinking fails most reliably in any context. The player who experienced the game alongside Isaac shared that condition. The game's structure directed attention toward the immediate environment, the corridor ahead, the necromorph behind, the resource count, the health level, the objective marker. The systemic architecture that produced the hive mind was present in the lore accessible through text logs and environmental detail, but the game's survival mechanics kept the player's cognitive resources directed at the same level of the threat hierarchy that kept every character's resources directed there. By the time the final confrontation arrived, the player had spent the entire game building the model of the situation that the game's structure had been guiding them toward. The hive mind was the source. Defeating it was the resolution. That model felt earned because the journey toward it had been long and difficult and genuinely harrowing. The relief at destroying the creature's vital organs was real because the experience of surviving the game to that point was real. The game let you have that relief. It did not take it away. The ending functions as an ending in all the ways endings are supposed to function. Survival confirmed. Threat defeated. Escape achieved. The narrative signals all fire in the correct sequence for resolution. Dead Space 2 reveals what was already true when those signals fired in the first game. The relief was genuine, the resolution was not. The blueprint was in Isaac's mind before the credits rolled. The system that the Hive Mind served was still running. The defeat of the local coordinator had not damaged the network. Everything Isaac had survived had produced the outcome the system needed, and the outcome moved away from Aegis VII in his shuttle, without either of them knowing what it was. The Hive Mind, in this light, is the most precisely constructed misdirection in the Dead Space universe. Not because the game lied to you, because the game let you build exactly the model of the situation that every character in the story built, and then deposited you into a sequel that began dismantling that model piece by piece. The reading of the Hive Mind as the final boss, the top of the threat hierarchy, the thing whose defeat resolved the disaster, was yours. The game provided the materials from which you built it. The materials were all real. The model was as coherent as Mercer's religious framework and as reasonable as Kine's scientific one, and it was wrong in the same structural direction that both of those were wrong. That is not a criticism of the player or the character or the doctor or the zealot. It is an observation about the system they were all inside. The system was designed to produce that misreading. The Brethren Moons built a machine whose local components were large and dramatic and comprehensible enough to absorb all available attention, while the machine's actual scale and purpose remained entirely outside the frame. Every person who encountered a hive mind looked at the most overwhelming visible thing in their environment and concluded that they had found the source of the problem. Every person was looking at a symptom. The illness itself was looking at them from behind something they could not yet see. What makes this worth understanding beyond the game's own narrative is what it reflects about a real cognitive pattern that operates in contexts well outside horror fiction. Research into how organizations and communities respond to complex systemic failures has found consistently that response effort concentrates on visible, immediate, local manifestations of problems rather than on the systemic conditions that produce those manifestations. The visible thing is addressed. The underlying condition continues. The visible thing recurs. The cycle persists because the response was designed for a level of the problem that the problem was not actually operating at. Dead Space encodes this pattern in the hive mind with a precision that makes it more than a monster story. The creature is the visible manifestation. The network is the systemic condition. Every response in the franchise, including Isaac's, addresses the manifestation and leaves the condition intact. The series does not resolve this cycle. It shows it operating, repeatedly, at increasing scales, with the humans inside it doing the most intelligent things available to them at the level of the problem they can see. The hive mind is the level of the problem everyone could see. The franchise is about what exists above it. There is one more thing that the creature's history asks of anyone willing to sit with it, something the analysis keeps approaching and the game keeps leaving unanswered because the answer has nowhere comfortable to land: the people inside it, the ones whose tissue was used to build it. What became of them is not confirmed in the canon. Whether that absence of confirmation is a deliberate choice in the lore, or simply an unaddressed detail, is itself unclear. What is clear is that the question sits at the heart of why the hive mind is more disturbing than a creature of its apparent category has any right to be. A large coordinating necromorph would be frightening on mechanical grounds alone. The hive mind is frightening on those grounds and on something else besides, something that the game installs inside you if you are paying the right kind of attention. It is the specific knowledge that the thing you are destroying is built from people. That knowledge is present in the lore from the moment the game establishes what necromorphs are and how the hive mind forms. The game gives you that knowledge and then asks you to do what survival requires. It does not resolve the tension between those two things. The tension just sits there in the final confrontation, underneath the mechanics and the relief of surviving them. Every wrong answer about the hive mind was built in the space where that tension lived. Mercer's answer resolved the tension by calling it elevation. Kine's answer resolved it by focusing on mechanism rather than meaning. Isaac's answer resolved it by making survival the only available frame. Each answer closed the uncomfortable gap the knowledge created. The gap was still there after each answer closed it. It did not go away because a framework was placed over it. Chapter 10. The Horror Underneath. The simplest true statement about the Dead Space universe, the one that all three games point toward and the third game finally says in full, is this: the Brethren moons have been running this system for longer than humanity has existed. The black marker that launched the entire human strand of this catastrophe arrived on Earth approximately 65 million years ago and was found buried deep within the planet long before the first hominid existed to receive its signal. The process was already underway before the species it would eventually claim had differentiated from its evolutionary predecessors. The hive mind on Aegis VII was assembled 200 years before the events of the first Dead Space game. 200 years of dormancy followed by hours of operation before Isaac Clarke defeated it, against the timeline the franchise eventually reveals. Those 200 years are a pause in a process that had been running for 65 million. The hours of operation are a rounding error. The defeat of this specific organism changed the outcome at this specific location and nothing else. The process continued on every other world where a marker was active, unaffected by what happened in one crater on one quarantined planet, in one restricted system. This is where the lore does something that most horror franchises do not do with this degree of structural consistency. It maintains the scale difference between the immediate horror and the systemic horror without ever collapsing them. The necromorphs are terrifying. The hive mind is overwhelming. The markers are incomprehensible in their function. The Brethren moons are beyond all frameworks that the characters in the story have available. Each level is genuinely terrifying at its own scale, and each level is also genuinely insignificant relative to the level above it. The hive mind on Aegis VII, as a local coordinator for a single necromorph outbreak, existed at the second lowest level of that structure. Above it was the marker. Above the marker were the Brethren moons. Above the moons was the network they composed, a galaxy-spanning distributed system of interconnected entities communicating through the marker signal, each one the product of a consumed civilization, collectively representing the accumulated biological material of every species the process had reached and processed across a span of time that human cognition can state but cannot feel. Beneath the hive mind were the individual necromorphs. Beneath them was the marker signal operating on the dead. At the very bottom of the structure were the living people the signal was working on, the ones it was slowly preparing for the conversion their deaths would enable. Isaac Clarke was at the bottom of that structure. He was the living person the marker was preparing for the function it needed him to serve. He was simultaneously the lowest active element in the hierarchy, and the element whose survival was most immediately important to the system's replication function at that location. The marker protected him in the sense that its influence kept him functional and directionally useful. The marker did not value him in any way that resembled how a person values another person. He was a component the process needed to be operational until the blueprint transfer was complete. His defeat of the hive mind, a component several levels above him in the same hierarchy, is the specific detail that makes the Dead Space story something beyond a survival narrative. A character at the bottom of a system defeating a component near the top of that system's local structure, while the system itself continued operating at every other level, while the network the local structure served remained entirely unaffected, while the very act of his survival served the system's larger purpose. The hero's journey and the system's design coincided exactly. Isaac survived. The process advanced. The hive mind is at the center of this dynamic because it was the component whose defeat felt like the resolution. Its scale, its physical drama, its position as the immediate commander of the threat that had been consuming the narrative for 12 chapters, made it the natural candidate for the climax's target. The game built toward it correctly. The creature deserved its position as the climax's object. and the act of defeating it genuinely changed the immediate situation in the way the immediate situation needed to be changed for survival. The fact that defeating it changed nothing about the system it served is a detail the game does not hide. It places the evidence in Isaac's shuttle, in the vision that arrives before the credits, in everything Dead Space 2 begins with and spends its entire runtime excavating. The evidence was always there. The presentation of the first game's ending gave you the relief of resolution and the materials to understand, if you held them up together, that the resolution was never complete. Research into what makes horror experiences psychologically persistent has found that the most durable unease does not come from threats that resolve clearly in either direction. A threat defeated cleanly leaves a clean memory. A threat that remains after you believe it is gone leaves something else, a residue that activates when the mind revisits the experience and finds the gap between what felt finished and what was actually finished. The persistence of that gap is what makes Dead Space as a series feel different from games whose horror is entirely local and entirely resolved by the player's survival. The hive mind on Aegis VII was defeated. The system that built it was not. The blueprint was in Isaac's head, moving through space on its way to producing the next component the system needed at the next location. Somewhere else, a marker was broadcasting. Somewhere else, the dead were converting. Somewhere else, the critical mass was building toward a new coordinator that the system would assemble from whatever bodies were available, with 5 vital points on its head and nerve clusters in its interior, and no awareness of the network it served or the scale of the process it was a small part of. The hive mind is not the horror of Dead Space. It is where the horror of Dead Space lives most visibly. The horror itself is what the hive mind points toward every time you let yourself look past it rather than at it. What the creature actually teaches, if you follow the lore to its furthest available point, is that the most overwhelming thing visible in a given context is rarely the source of what is producing it. The hive mind was the most overwhelming thing visible in Aegis VII's final hours. It was not the source of the necromorph outbreak. It was not the source of the marker's design. It was not the source of the signal that drove the living toward breakdown and the dead toward conversion. Every element of the disaster that produced it came from levels of the structure that the creature itself had no awareness of, and that every human character involved was too occupied by the creature's visible presence to examine. Chalice Mercer spent his last hours aboard the Ishimura in devotion to something that had no awareness of him. Dr. Terrence Kyne spent his last hours in the belief that a surviving engineer could use the marker to stabilize a situation. The marker was actively using both of them to advance. Isaac Clarke spent the game moving through a ship and a colony and a final confrontation carrying something inside his mind that he had no way to feel or identify. A blueprint that every action he took was simultaneously escaping from and delivering toward its next destination. All 3 of them were intelligent. All 3 of them were trying. All 3 of them were working with the best available information from inside an experience that was designed to prevent anyone inside it from seeing the full picture. The hive mind sat at the center of all of it, too large to ignore, too present to look past, too physically dramatic to treat as anything other than the source of the horror. Exactly as it was supposed to be, exactly as the system needed it to be. That is the final thing to understand about this creature, and about what Dead Space is built to do to the person experiencing it. The game reproduces in you the same cognitive condition it portrays in its characters. You cannot look past the hive mind while you are surviving it. The mechanics will not allow it. The immediate demands of the environment consume the attention that systemic analysis requires. You arrive at the final confrontation with the same model of the situation that Mercer and Kyne and Isaac arrived with, built from the same kind of locally available information, organized around the same assumption that the largest visible thing is the most important thing. You defeat it. You feel the relief that comes with having survived something genuinely difficult and genuinely frightening. The game confirms the resolution in all the ways resolution is supposed to feel. And then the next game begins and shows you what you were carrying. The hive mind is the most misunderstood entity in Dead Space because understanding it correctly requires seeing something that the game's own structure prevents you from seeing until after you believe the story is over. Every character who looked at it was doing the same thing you were doing, building the best available model from the information inside the frame, calling the most overwhelming visible thing the source, moving through an experience designed to make anything else invisible. The creature in the crater was never what anyone thought it was. The crater was never where the real thing lived. What lived above the crater, what had been there long before the crater existed, what had seeded the planet with its signal 65 million years before any human being existed to receive it, was patient enough to wait through every failed convergence event, every defeated hive mind, every escaped engineer carrying a blueprint it needed delivered. The hive mind slept for 200 years and woke when the conditions changed. The network it served had been awake for 65 million. That is the architecture of the horror, and now you know the shape of it. The hive mind is gone. The system is not. Isaac Clarke went on to Dead Space 2, carrying what Aegis VII put inside him, moving toward the next piece of the process he thought he had ended. The Brethren moons went on doing what they had always done. The signal kept broadcasting. The dead kept converting. Somewhere in the galaxy, the right amount of biomass kept accumulating around the right marker, moving toward the next local coordinator, the next version of the same creature, built from whoever happened to be dead at the time. The pattern does not care that you understand it now. It just keeps running.